very good morning, afternoon and evening to all of you. I'm here with John at Hampstead Heath and we're going to be discussing progressive legislation. A very good morning to you, John.
Good morning to you, Marvi. That is
Welcome
indeed
back.
our theme today, and I look forward to covering this very important subject, which is a challenge really to legislatures
Everywhere.
right across the world.
Yeah. So on Parliamentary Ponderings, we bring to you what we consider progressive legislation. We obviously have a grand strategy, and within that grand strategy, we're trying to cover those pieces of legislation that you and I we've dealt with. You, of course, have dealt with all sorts of legislation in 10 years of being Speaker and 22 years of being MP. Myself as well, a little bit. I want to start off with perhaps two of your pieces, which you've seen many pieces go through in front of your eyes, but the ones that you consider important from an equality, equity, DEI perspective, and those SDGs. Because remember, every legislation that we are going to be talking about is connected to an SDG, to the Agenda 2030. And parliaments all across the world are functioning in that sense, that they consider each legislation and they bracket it inside some particular SDG. So they are working towards a larger objective beyond their own parliaments, towards the UN objective. So how about, let's start with the Equality Act. Is that okay?
Yes. Actually, for me, Marvi, the Equality Act came relatively late in my time as a Member of Parliament. I do recall on the 11th of May 2009 speaking from the Conservative backbenches in support of the Labour government's Equality Bill. The essence of that bill was to consolidate all previous legislation and to focus on outlawing discrimination, promoting equality of opportunity, and imposing on public authorities a duty to promote equality. To me, it seemed an extremely sensible, forward-looking, progressive piece of legislation. I'm sorry to say that I was the only Conservative Member of Parliament to speak in support of it and to vote for it. Yes. Wow. I remember at the time the Conservative opposition was against it, saying that it didn't think that a new piece of legislation was necessary. And in particular, I remember the Conservatives were against the public sector duty that the legislation imposed on public authorities to promote equality. They thought it was bureaucratic and that it was better to have a voluntary approach. I think that there is scope for voluntary approaches by private business, publicly floated companies and so on. Of course, many of them will think that it's in their interest to get the best workforce and therefore to promote diversity and equality and inclusion. But I think that the two things, legislation and cultural change or voluntary activity, needn't be mutually exclusive. In other words, it's possible to have both approaches and to have almost, if you will, a pincer movement. And what the Labour government was arguing is, yes, there's all sorts of good voluntary steps being taken, but we need a legislative framework. And I thought that was right, and so I voted for the legislation. I remember that day telling the Conservative chief whip that I would be voting for the bill when it wasn't Conservative policy to do so, and he looked a bit disappointed. Yes, and I said, well, I'm just informing you, Patrick, that that's what I intend to do. And he said, oh, well, the vote probably won't be till 10 o'clock, so you can disappear for a while. And I said, no, I won't be doing that. And he said, why not? And I said, well, I shall be there all afternoon for the debate. And he said, why? And I said, because I want to speak. To which he replied, oh no, why do you want to do that? And I said, well, Patrick, I'm a Member of Parliament. I have views and I want to express them. So I did, and I remember at the time Theresa May was the shadow minister. She later became leader of the Conservative Party, and she said she thought the bill wasn't necessary. And I remember saying to her in the debate, in the chamber, on the floor of the House, that her attitude reminded me of what Churchill said about Stanley Baldwin at the time when the Nazis were rearming and we were underprepared. Churchill said of Baldwin that he was resolved only to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. In other words, sitting on the fence, doing nothing, making no difference. And I said, I think that we ought to be doing something and making a difference. This is a good bill, and I intend to vote for it. And it was the last speech I made as a backbench MP before I was elected Speaker 6 weeks later.
So that is quite monumental in the sense that it did...
And the bill passed, of course.
And the bill passed, and then you became Speaker after that.
And then I became Speaker after
so
that.
that bodes super well. And it's a really important piece of legislation. And let me tell you why I wanted to talk about it with you, because I obviously had read up on it because of your book. Simply because it's, when we talk about model legislations, which are important for SDGs and which can connect all the countries, this is one which has been flagged internationally, and the UK is known for this particular legislation. So it's a pity if people within the legislature, within Parliament, did not take it so seriously at the time, you know. But that's normal, that's okay. We're used to that. We're used to negotiations. We're used to, you know, people who block bills just for the sake of politics, versus for the sake of looking at that particular legislation and thinking, how will this actually help the SDGs, or how will this actually help productivity in my country, how will this help all those goals which are hopefully part of grand strategy. But if a country doesn't even have a grand strategy, then
and
what
of
are we
course,
discussing?
a piece of legislation, Marvi, as we know and as our viewers will know, doesn't transform life, or in this case achieve equality overnight, or necessarily at all, but it's part of a process. And I suppose the question one had to ask oneself is, will this bill on the whole help or hinder or make no difference? And I was convinced in my mind, rightly I think, that it would help, and that's why I chose to speak in the debate and to vote for the measure.
I'm glad we've spoken about this. The second one, John, that I want you briefly to touch on is the LGBT legislation.
Yes. For me, the first step, and I was a Conservative MP who hadn't given much thought to it, was to support an equal age of consent for sexual activity as between heterosexuals and gay people. Until the early noughties, it was illegal for anyone under the age of 18 to have gay sex. And the Labour government under Tony Blair brought forward a piece of legislation called the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill to make it legal for gay men over the age of 16 to have sex.
And which year was this?
Other.
Because
that was in the year 2000. I think it finally reached the statute
2 years back.
About 2001.
Okay,
so
so
it's a little over 20 years ago. And at the time, there were a few
Was it revolutionary at the time?
Well, at the time, it was regarded as bold and progressive. The Labour Party was overwhelmingly in support of it.
But not
the Conservatives were overwhelmingly against it, with a few honourable exceptions. In my case, I had thought about it. I'd previously voted against equalisation, but I'd thought about it, and I'd gone away and talked to people in the education system, people in the church and so on. And nobody seemed to be able to give me, Marvi, any good reason why there should be a statutory discrimination. And in fact, there were good arguments in the name of transparency and access to health advice and so on, why the age should be equalised. So I changed my mind, and I took advice from a rather liberal-minded Conservative member, much older than I, who was himself a supporter of equality. I took advice from him. He said to me, John, may I make a suggestion? And I said, Tim, please do. And he said, if you've changed your mind, you shouldn't just vote for equality. You should speak in the debate. He said, the House is always interested to hear from someone who's changed his or her mind. So I applied to the Speaker and said that I wanted to speak in the debate. It was on 10th of February 2000. Wow, so it was a little over 22 years ago. And I spoke for 13 minutes and made the argument for equality. And the funny thing is, at the time, there were people, it just shows how people react strangely. There were people who said, oh, is there a subliminal message here? And I said, I beg your pardon. And there was a Conservative member who kept saying this to me, and I said, what do you mean? And he said, are you coming out? In other words, Marvi, he thought the reason I was supporting equality was that actually I was gay. I was at the time
selfish self.
I was a single man at the time. And there was another person who was a friend of mine, actually, who meant well. He didn't mean ill. He was a friend of mine at the time, a Conservative colleague, who said to me, John, you absolutely should not do this. And I said, why not? He said, you should not speak on these matters, at any rate not until you are married. And I said, no, I don't agree with that at all.
This is the United Kingdom. I'm going to now quickly
So I'm a straight ally.
No, I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to say that as a Pakistani Muslim woman, these are not the kind of pieces of legislation that we would be legislating on because they're a bit too much for us.
Sure,
but I did want to mention it because in the West, these are very normal legislations. This is part of international human rights. There's nothing
I accept that countries approach these things in different ways.
As a Pakistani, this is not something
timescales.
I would be getting into, but I want to maintain that this is international legislation that is totally acceptable in many parts of the world. Coming back to the whole process of very quickly, it's not a piece of cake. Like you demonstrated, that you think of something, you consult with experts in the area, you have a lot of consultations, a lot of negotiations with a lot of party people perhaps, and then you actually go through the parliamentary system, and then you go through the whole process of the committees, first the House and the committees. There is so much that goes behind one legislation, which then finally makes it from a bill to an act.
Yes, and it takes several months. It's not a joke, and it's not a press release.
I'll give you my first. The first legislation we already discussed were the PIPs, but the second, which made it to an Oscar-winning documentary for Pakistan, Pakistan's first Oscar-winning documentary, which Sharmeen Chinoy did, and the documentary was called Saving Face. But the legislation was asset crime control. And I, very quickly, for our viewers, was faced with situations where I was visiting a lot of vulnerable people in Pakistan, and some of them had been burnt by acid. Women who had been burnt by acid, thrown by men and the reason they had been thrown acid on was because they had refused the advances of these men.
Right.
Perhaps marriage offers or even something not so honorable, right? And so I met this one girl, Maria from Shikarpur, Sindh, Pakistan, and she was dying on her deathbed in one of the in Burns ward in Karachi's hospital, and she just held on to my hand and she said, and it still gives me, I still shiver when I think of that situation. It was in 2009. It's now 2022, and she said, Adi, I am dying. It's the end of it for me. But the other girls must not be faced with what I have faced. So you need to do something. You need to do something. She said it, of course, in my mother tongue. And it still gives me the shivers. And I immediately thought, I need to do something. So I did. And it took me 2 years, to cut a long story short, to go through the entire system.
Wow.
And then finally, we came up with this incredible legislation, which is now quoted internationally.
And what's it called?
It's called the Asset Crime Control Act.
Okay.
And then there was a version 1.0, which I did in the opposition days. I tried to do a version 2.2, which was a much advanced version, which meant that it wasn't just giving punishment to the person who had done this and putting him behind bars or compensation. It was creating an entire institutionalized mechanism for dealing with such cases at a government level.
Yep.
On my last day, as in my second tenure, we had just passed it from the lower house. So it never made it to the upper house.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people try a lot of legislation.
And did the legislation then fall?
The first one is still standing.
Okay.
The second version 2.0 fell.
Fell. Okay.
So you understand.
But nevertheless, you made some real progress.
Yeah. So that
and
made
was
is
essentially an equality initiative. And it was a protective initiative.
And
it was
when
an initiative that made a real difference
Yes.
to some very vulnerable people.
Absolutely. And when we look at that, I think we can safely say that asset crime control, when it comes to the SDGs, it falls very critically in SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So we touched 3 specific SDGs on that, wasn't it, Joe? Second one, which I very quickly want to go through, is super important as well. Well, they're all important. Is early marriage, meaning if a child is
This would mean effectively forced marriage.
Forced marriage, absolutely, and if the particular person is less than 18 years, then sorry, but they have no legal right to get married as such.
Yeah.
Many Islamic Muslim countries have this legislation.
Yeah.
Very quickly, when I came up with it, I was it made it through, interestingly, to the committee system, and I had a very logical answer. I had logical sort of my thesis was very logical, and I'd gone through all the Islamic countries that they have this, so Pakistan will not be the first to have it.
Yeah.
And the Council of Islamic Ideology was present in that particular meeting, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And they said, if you go ahead with this, Ms. Memon, we might just invoke the blasphemy laws against you.
Yeah.
Now, blasphemy is blasphemous in the sense that that's the end of me, not just my career in politics, that's small.
Yeah.
That's the end of me as a human being. They can kill me for it.
Yeah.
So I just looked, and that was my first, the newspapers called it this first strategic retreat. I said, yeah, it's a strategic retreat. And they were stunned. They said, so you will withdraw the legislation? Because they knew I was never going to, I was not the kind who would withdraw legislation. I was very gung-ho about everything I did. So they weren't expecting me to back off so easily. The minute I heard blasphemy, I said, it's not that I want to live, it's that I have a lot of work to do in my life. I have a mission, I have Britai's mission. I have 6 million people who are dependent on me in terms of that social safety net. I can't be short-term and foolish about this. I need to plan this. We planned it. So the good news on the early marriage is that I failed initially, but one of the provincial assemblies, my home province, Sindh, I'm very pleased to say, took that up. And they actually passed it. There was no Council of Islamic Ideology in that particular meeting. So there was no blasphemy on any of those legislators.
And has that been replicated elsewhere across the country?
I think they were in the process of doing it in the other provinces. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, that process continued. So what I'm trying to explain is that doesn't mean that if you fail once, that's the end of it.
No.
You can take it from the federal level and you can launch it. It's just strategies, right?
Yes.
Strategies of trying to get it sorted in the other provincial level and then come back to the...
Well, funny enough, it's interesting you should say that, because it wasn't a clash between national and local, between federal and provincial in the UK, but there was a clash in the sense that, casting my mind back to 2000, 2001, the Blair government wanted that equalisation of the age of consent. The House of Lords was against it, and the House of Lords blocked it and blocked it and blocked it. And what attitude did Tony Blair take? Did he take the attitude, oh, well, I've been defeated, I shall have to abandon the idea? No, he just took the view, right, well, I'll introduce the legislation again. And he did. And eventually, I think at either the second or third time of asking, it got through, it became law. So if you think you've got right on your side, you have to go for it. I should just mention, by the way, that after I became Speaker, so many, many years later, in 2013, under the coalition government of David Cameron and Nick Clegg, the Conservative Lib Dem coalition government, Parliament passed the same-sex marriage legislation. And so there is now a right for gay people to get married in the way there is for straight people. Now there were objections, and a lot of MPs opposed. But I remember myself taking the attitude with my constituents. I said, look, as Speaker, I can't vote unless there's a tie. But if you're asking me what do I personally think, well, I'm in favour of it. And my attitude is that if marriage is a strong institution, it doesn't depend for its survival on denying gay people the right to be part of it. In other words, it was said by some people, well, if you legalise same-sex marriage, it will damage the institution of marriage. I don't myself believe that. I think that
everyone's entitled to their view, but they have to give a
people feel that
logic.
It's a good institution, well, why shouldn't people who are of the same sex have the opportunity to partake of it? In other words, it's sometimes said, oh, well, gay relationships are less secure, they're less stable, they're less long-lasting. Well, if people are prepared to make a commitment to each other in a same-sex partnership, why shouldn't they be able to do so with legal means?
Coming back to early
marriage,
if children get married before they're 18, it affects their health, it affects their well-being, it affects violence. They're subjected to a lot of violence.
They're the differences between being a child and being an adult.
Yeah, so there's 100 million girls out there, child brides they call them. 100 million girls. Whose lives are going to be finished because they're not going to have access to education, they're not going to have a normal childhood, they're not going to be healthy when they produce kids when they're under. So there was a lot of meat in there, and there was a lot of meat in terms of Islamic countries who had done it. So I don't want to get into too much of the Islamic side of it, but I'm just trying to demonstrate how it gets defeated, how it rises again. It's all to do with your will at the end of the day. And this affects SDG 10, reduce inequality, SDG 16, peace and justice, and the gender gap SDG. So, and I just want to inform our viewers that Malawi has done a good legislation thanks to its First Lady, Monica Chakwera, and Lebanon has done a good legislation on this, Marie-Claude Najem, in 2020 to 21. So, in terms of model legislation, the reason why we're trying to show enhanced adhesion, which is in fact Constable's area.
Constable's area, absolutely, it's a very beautiful part of London.
Yeah, it is. That this is just one of those legislations. I want to now come specifically to a really interesting one, which I believe is really important. Let's finish with the equality side. There's a NASDAQ legislation that is specific on DEI. and not many people know about it. So when I used to say NASDAQ and gender pay gap and gender equality, everyone used to look at me and say, we didn't know about this. Let me just take you through it. So it's called, it's the area is the Organization of the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC of the USA. The name of the is the NASDAQ. The name of the legislation is Final Rules, and within that, the final rules require most NASDAQ-listed companies, other than exempt entities and companies with boards consisting of 5 or fewer members, to have at least 2 self-identified diverse members of its board of directors.
Okay.
Explain why the company does not have the minimum number of directors on its boards who evidently self-identify as diverse. Of the 2 self-identified diverse directors, at least 1 director must self-identify as female,
Yep.
and at least 1 director must self-identify as a underrepresented minority and or LGBTQ. So you see that even within, and I was impressed, I mean, my teams, of course, were doing this research for me. It is supported by an international model, which is the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, Beijing Declaration, the platform for action. And there are, I mean, there's a lot of academics who've written on this. Qatar and India and Syria and have actually done some work on it as well. Can you beat that? But I couldn't. I said, how is that possible? They said, ma'am, we've done the research. Here it is. And they have sources, and they don't produce anything minus sources, my team. I'm very proud of them. So what I'm saying is, when it comes to participation in democracy or gender equality or the pay gap or the rest of it, even stock exchanges. Now, if NASDAQ has done it, there's millions of others, not millions, but there's many other stock exchanges who can do the same. And this can act as a model. So our objective really should be, and I think yours and mine has been through this particular pondering, parliamentary pondering, is to flag progressive legislation, flag good things.
Flag progressive legislation,
flag reforms.
and indicate that voluntarism has a role, but voluntarism is not sufficient. Voluntarism on its own won't bring about the desired change in anything like a reasonable timescale, and that's why I think that you have to have some sort of legislative cue, or for example, where you're talking about a workplace, if you know that you're underrepresented in terms of women or in terms of BAME staff, I think you have to have targets. You have to have, not necessarily quotas, but you have to have targets for improvement. I mean, for example, at one point I was absolutely horrified. There's sometimes quotas as well, and I think it's not a uniform picture. There are countries around the world, including your own, where there is a very progressive attitude towards getting more women into Parliament, and in a way it's more progressive than in the UK.
True.
I think that if you have targets, it will tend to encourage the organisation to take decisive steps to bring about change. I was absolutely shocked at one point as Speaker to discover that of 84 senior Commons service staff, what were known as SCS staff, of 84, not one identified as black or minority ethnic.
Sad.
And I thought that was absolutely terrible. This is a national
More
institution.
than sad, it's not progressive.
It's not progressive at all. This is a national institution, and it's the democratic legislature of the United Kingdom. You know, it is both in our interests to be diverse in terms of having a range of experience and representing society, and it should be part of our DNA.
And what about pay
It should
gaps?
be part of our DNA.
What about pay gaps?
Well, likewise with pay gaps, I think that the key in the first instance is to have transparency. So you have to have gender pay gap reporting, and you know that is becoming more and more established now in the UK. But I didn't think it's enough just to report the fact. You also need equality legislation which enables people who are being unfairly treated to get that changed. Now, an early step 50 years ago was the so-called Equal Pay Act, but the Equal Pay Act in the UK was a very limited scope, and there were lots of ways of companies extricating themselves from it. I think it is necessary to have legislation that basically makes it absolutely clear that where people are doing the same work, they should get the same pay, and you shouldn't have either this sort of occupational segregation whereby women are excluded from certain types of work and therefore they remain less well paid.
Sounds becoming very progressive on that, and a lot of areas where you wouldn't see women earlier, like flying, fighter jet pilots, this, that. I mean, it really funds not fun, but exciting, adventurous stuff. I'm really proud of and also of the kind of women empowerment legislation. We don't have time today, but sexual harassment, harassment at workplace, there's a whole...
No, but Marvi, I want to know, as we wrap up, and I think your viewers, our viewers, will want to know, in terms of your proudest legislative achievement as a minister, what is it?
It would be the asset legislation, because that really made a difference. There was a lot of women being burnt and burnt alive, and they wouldn't recover from those burns, and they would be defaced, and they would be finished as internally and externally, either dead or handicapped for the rest of their lives. So now those people are going to jail. It's a huge feeling of phew.
So there, in a sense, you made a difference.
Oh, you did too. I mean, you've got so much experience. Just quickly, the kind of two legislations that my team has flagged on gender pay gap. One is Iceland, which has a legislation called the IST standard, Equal Pay Management System of 2012. And then there's, in the US, it's called the Lilly Let Better Fair Pay Act of 2009 by Barbara Mikulski, who's a senator. So what I'm trying to say is, there's a lot of good pieces out there.
Yes.
And I think we just need to exchange.
Politicians who are interested in making change in this area should literally shop around.
Should shop around.
And look to those parts of the world where there has been change. Of course, there are parts of the world that are very reactionary, very backward-looking, not at all progressive. Yeah. But a lot of good work is being done in many different democracies around the world. And I think that one should look for the best exemplars of progressive legislation and be ready to learn from them.
So in terms of other legislation, which I wanted to flag today, not now moving away from gender, moving into a very important subject, climate change. There's a piece that I found which is net zero business legislation for companies to eliminate, now this is important, deforestation from supply chains, and especially with this Ukraine situation and the pandemic and everything combined, is very important. So deforestation, to eliminate deforestation from supply chains, which includes transparent reporting on progress made by companies in food, land use and agriculture sector. Regenerative agriculture. So the concept of regenerative agriculture, tracked by technology and forest financing. Now this specifically, two multinationals, one of whom I've actually done some work with in terms of financial and economic inclusion, which is Nestle, and the other one is Unilever. Their CEOs, they made a pitch for this, and they said, we will make our supply chains, we will deforest, right? The deforestation of supply chains. They were very big on this. Now, if you have progressive pieces like this out there, isn't it normal and natural for the other multinationals to actually implement the same? Because at the end of the day, their goals should be similar. They all of us should be working towards SDGs. Clearly, this is a very big SDG initiative on the climate change side. What do you say?
Well, I'm very much in favour of it, because I think that huge numbers of people are employed in the private sector, and the private sector is responsible for a large part of our national output. So, in a sense, if the commercial sector isn't doing its bit on climate change, it's very difficult to achieve a step change in the battle against climate change. So I'm very much in favour of reform. Some big hitters in the private sector will naturally want to do the right thing, but some won't, and that's why I feel that you do have to have some sort of legislative framework to require people to behave in an environmentally sustainable way. So exhortation, encouragement, etc. has a role, but I think that you also need some sort of legislative instrument, because after all, the fight against climate change is now. It's here. It's urgent. It's pressing.
Everyone's talking about it. Well, let's legislate
But you actually
together.
got to be able to do things to make a difference. Otherwise, we could be having the same conversation in 10, 20, 30, 40 or 50 years' time.
Another one, carbon food labeling legislation.
Yes.
This is now coming up for supermarkets, that when you pick up a product in the supermarket, you need to know, you need to have a carbon food label on it.
Yeah.
And this is now being debated. This is not rocket science, nor is it very, it's not something that will be done in 10 years' time. It is happening in 2022. And what I'm trying to say is that if this is happening in a few countries in 2022, it doesn't really help. You need to make this happen everywhere. So the momentum needs to be built, because for this to actually make sense on ground and actually save the planet, as such, bigger objective. But everyone should be doing it. Is it logical? Yes. Is it good for us? Yes. Can it be done? Yes. So why wait? Logical, no?
I think that
is there
argument for
a
waiting is non-existent.
Yeah. And is everyone screaming and shouting about climate change? Yes.
Yes.
So, well, this is a good initiative. Take it. Run with it.
I think the difficulty is that there is a huge public political commitment to fighting climate change. And asked whether people agree with that commitment, the vast majority of people will say yes. The problem arises when particular sectors feel threatened by the implications. In other words, there will be particular sectors who say, but if you do this, it will cause job losses here, there, or elsewhere. So you get that, for example, in the United States. You know, the parts of the US where, for example, environmentally unfriendly sources of power are dominant, well, they don't want change because there's employment there and they don't want to lose those jobs. But in a sense, I think you have to take a long view and say, well, if it hadn't been for the Industrial Revolution, we wouldn't have advanced, we wouldn't have progressed. We'd still be doing things in a way that we did them 150 years ago. And I don't think that works. If you are going to make major change, for example, in tackling the despoliation of our environment, there are going to be consequences, and it may well be that some jobs are lost, but then in the renewables sector, other jobs are created. And I think, therefore, we've got to have
a
clear, holistic view, a strategic goal, and then a route map to its realization.
I'm now going to come very quickly, and this is the last, well, nearly the last segment. One is financial economic inclusion, which is my favorite. Well, I'm involved with that with the World Bank and the PEI, the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. So, yes, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the social safety net, but I do want to flag one thing, which is that stunting and malnutrition is a huge issue everywhere in the developing world and the underdeveloped and the least developed countries. And productivity of nations is completely stunted because the brains of those individuals are stunted. It requires something as simple as supplements to be given to mother and child between from 0 to 1,000 days. It's a simple concept. Everyone supports it. All the big international UN organizations support it. The best way in is, in my humble opinion, through a social safety net. I have done that in Pakistan. We launched Pakistan's first malnutrition stunting program through the Benazir Income Support Program, and it was a conditional cash transfer, meaning the women who were getting a normal unconditional cash transfer, meaning normally if they were poor, they were getting normal sort of stipends on a 3-monthly or quarterly basis. We were trying to make it monthly at one point. Additional to that, if they were feeding themselves and their children this particular supplement, which was quite tasty. I remember I was campaigning. It was like a chocolatey thing. I was campaigning all over the country promoting this as minister. They would then get extra cash. So there was a cash incentive that if you take care of your children's mental, like your brains and your own cells, and you avoid malnutrition and stunting, you get an extra piece of cash. This needs to be made compulsory, in my humble opinion, every single place where there's stunting and malnutrition, because a state cannot progress with half dead brains. The GDP cannot go forward. It's calculation for finance. On the finance side, the finance ministries just need to see it. Do you want productivity? Do you want GDP? Then you need to invest in it. It's something as simple and small as this. Now, something I want your opinion on is truth commissions for resolving past grievances of minorities, conflict victims in civil wars, etc. How do you feel about truth commissions?
I think that they can be great cleansing mechanisms. They can act not as cures but as palliatives for the pain caused by the past, and they can help countries come to terms with their pasts and to enable them to move forward harmoniously together. What's the caveat? I suppose my caveat is that for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be effective, it has to have buy-in from really all the major disputing parties. I think if it's supported by one side but not by another, then it almost inevitably fails. It falls by the wayside. It's not going to work. But if you can get people who were previously polar opposites to come together, to reach across the aisle, as the Americans would say, to reach out to previous enemies and to talk to and hear from and engage with each other, and to accept that wrong was done, not just on one side, but perhaps on both sides, well, then I think there's a lot to be said for them. There's a lot to be said for them. I mean, we've seen it in South Africa, for example.
Yes, South Africa. And
you know, and
I've seen it in Canada.
Have you?
And I've seen some really good pieces coming out of there. And I have colleagues who've done some incredible work on that side. So I'm quite impressed with the Canadian models. Everyone has their own, not favorites, but everyone has been exposed to different truth commissions.
Yeah.
But that's the one I was thinking of. Last but not the least, something which was topical some time back in your country, the Rwanda issue and how IDPs have been treated. Don't you think we need some kind of legislation on that? So there is some equality. There is the kind of discrimination that does take place is stopped, and that there is some check and balance on the executive, that when they have policies like the one on the Rwanda side, someone can say, no, this is against this particular act, you can't go ahead. What do you think?
There's a huge challenge to protect human rights around the world. And I have seen in different parts of the world, I've seen, for example, in Darfur, Western Sudan, people in IDP camps living the most appalling existence. And one would want that to be tackled and changed. There are many states around the world, of course, that are guilty of being rogue states, effectively, not observing any principle of human rights. The way in which you tackle it in practice is hugely challenging. In other words, you can't just pass a law and say this won't happen and it will stop happening. There is a huge debate to be had about what I call R2P, responsibility to protect, and the balance between the sovereignty of a nation on the one hand and the rights of its citizens on the other. So, for example, put very, very, very simply, the Iraqi regime under Saddam would have said, well, we've got a right to run our affairs as we think fit, and nobody else has got a right to interfere. And I think my answer to that would be to say, you've got a right to run your own affairs as you think fit, subject to a basic respect for human life. And where a regime engages in massive ethnic cleansing or deploys chemical weapons against its own people, I think it loses the right to plead the defence of sovereignty. In other words, I don't think a country has got the right to retreat behind the cloak of sovereignty to justify any action that it wants to take. If a country wants to be a responsible part of the international community and to be treated with respect, then it's got to treat its own people with respect.
Absolutely. And I think on that we shall close today. And I just want to say that we are lacking one institutionalized element here, which you and I we've discussed off air, which is the Legislative Alliance for Progressive Legislation. So LAPO, if you like, Legislative Alliance for Progressive Legislation, LAPO, which means that parliamentarians all over the world get together, exchange views, and say, well, this is something that we have done right on this particular SDG. How about you doing the same? It reminds me of what I learned as a young corporate person from Citibank, that if Citibank, let's say Pakistan was doing something, how was it going to be success transferred quickly in another part of Citibank? They didn't have to and we were always told, don't reinvent the wheel, don't reinvent the wheel. Just take it from the other places and then make it happen in your own country. Of course, localize it. But it's a faster process, isn't it? Because you're not relearning. So it has always stuck with me, this concept of success transfer. We don't have success transfer. There's the IPU with great respect. I respect and admire the IPU in Geneva. There are many organizations within the UN who have who are promoting progressive legislation. But our parliamentarians coming together in terms of an alliance, I think you and I, we need to take that process forward.
I think we do.
On that fine note. So
on that note, we end this particular episode of Parliamentary Ponderings, but we look forward to others.
Thank you so much. Take care and bye-bye.